All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Glad for those of you who are getting a lunch out of it, and welcome to the NYU Law Forum. My name is Ruth Marcus. I am a writer these days at the New Yorker magazine, so I'm glad to be here in New York for a change. But I live in Washington, D.C., and worked most of my career at the Washington Post, where I did meet a man named Bob Bauer. We're going to be talking democracy today with three of your professors who need no introduction, but just in case, Bob Bauer, Rick Pildes, Sam Zakharov, cannot think of three smarter, more engaged, more intellectually wide-ranging people to talk about democracy with than these three. So let's just get started, and let's start with talking about the very unambitiously named Democracy Project, how it got started, and what you've done and where you're going from here. And Bob, why don't you start us off on that?
The Democracy Project was set up as a site, a locus for a cross-partisan, cross-ideological dialogue about issues of democratic self-governance, both in the United States and abroad. And I want to emphasize, and we'll have a chance to talk about the international component as well. Obviously, there's a lot of this kind of discussion taking place for all the reasons everybody in this room is familiar with. But we thought that there was room for a really focused effort to bring a wide range of voices together on this topic in dialogue. And it opened with a series called 100 Ideas in 100 days, and we were really pleased with the response, both on the part of the contributors who wanted to sign up, again, across the ideological and political spectrum, and the response that we also got from the readership. And we have a lot still to do, both in the development of the site and the associated programming, so I'll let my colleagues speak to the balance.
Where are we headed from here?
Well, I think we had a number of different goals in getting this off the ground. One is, as Bob said, there are a lot of places where you can find discussions about democracy. There are almost none where you can find people of very different ideological perspectives actually engaging with each other. And that's one of the commitments we've had, and one of the things that I think has been successful about our initial series on challenges democracy is facing today, and different perspectives different people have on that. I think a second thing we wanted to do was to try to situate the struggles, challenges of American democracy over the last 10 to 15 years in the larger international context, to help people understand that the things they may be very fixated on here actually are going on in most of the Western democracies. And then I think we want to move into a stage, which we've already begun to do, called What's Next, in which we bring together people to now talk about ideas on institutional reform, whether it's on issues concerning Congress or the election process, the presidential nominations process, a whole range of issues, but bringing these people together who have very different starting points to start trying to figure out whether there's room for solutions that can generate the kind of consensus to actually move the political system forward.
So I just want to add to this that if you've spent your career in journalism as I have, you come to these things with a certain degree of skepticism about the possibility for change. But I do want to say, in appreciation for what you're doing, don't ask, don't get. Don't try, don't get. If we just accept the system for the way it is and the flaws that it has, and we don't, as sclerotic as Congress is, as messed up as the current voting arrangements are, as polarized as we appear to be, if you don't try to fix it, it is not going to fix itself. So I just want to say, from my genetically and temperamentally cynical perspective, thank you on that. And maybe we should, I want to launch into a discussion about the international setting that we're in. But before we do that, I think the technical title of this program is about democracy in an age of extremism and polarization. And we were talking about this earlier. I feel like I have been going to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's just my snippy way of talking, to hand-wringing sessions where we bemoan the lack of bipartisanship and bemoan polarization and extremism and, failure of comedy across the aisle for about the 40-something years that I've been in Washington. So I guess one thing, and Bob, you might be best at this because you have lived it, is how is this Washington, we're getting on the Seder for those of you who celebrate, how is this Washington different from previous Washingtons?
Well, this is an entirely personal perspective, but at the risk, the inevitable result of dating myself, I started becoming very active in politics through my law practice in the 1970s. And I would say that a difference that I noted, again, as I experienced it, was that parties had very strong disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements became very strident. But I did not detect the thoroughgoing mutual contempt that I think characterizes the relationships between the two parties and even federal elected officials associated with the two parties who are working in the same body. And I was very struck when I was younger by images of a very liberal senator and a very conservative senator having a very energetic and sharply in disagreement dialogue on the floor of the Senate. And then when that debate was done, they would be walking, smiling, and chatting with each other out the door, and in one case I remember arm in arm. That simply isn't the tone in Washington any longer. It's disagreement coupled with, very heavily influenced by, infused with questioning of motives, as I mentioned, contempt. So I do think that that's very striking. And of course, I think it also mirrors much of what we see in the polarized debate in the country at large.
And I would say, as a journalist, that things have been frayed and difficult for decades, but I think contempt is a very good word to describe efforts to have professional relations with people who think, I'm a liberal columnist / writer for the liberal New Yorker magazine. There's just a degree of contemptuousness and a failure to understand, and it's not just me, it's, look at what the Pentagon is doing to the reporters who try to cover it. Just, a cross-government attitude of the press is the enemy of the state thing that is, it doesn't serve actually anybody's purposes, because if you speak to a reporter, they're going to do something to try, if they're a good and honest reporter, to reflect your point of view. If you speak to a member of the other party, that's the only way you're going to understand what their point of view is and how to get to yes, but of course getting to yes may not be where we are. Sam, something is going on in Washington, but the something that's going on in Washington has manifestations or echoes or maybe precursors elsewhere in the democratic world. So situate where we are with what you think is going on internationally in terms of stresses and strains on democracy and, in fact, incursions on it.
Well, let me start with a point that may not be obvious. Dissent is good. Partisanship is good. Strongly drawn lines are good. Strongly held positions are good. You should hate those sons of bitches who don't agree with you, who don't see the logic of your position. That's what politics is about. Without that, it's mindless. It's just technocratic, how many sewer caps are we going to have per mile of paving roads? The difficulty is what happens with that intensity. For people like me, and I'll go academic for 1 second, who come from a tradition associated with Joseph Schumpeter, that tension is good because they then argue among themselves, and we, the citizenry, listen and are educated once every 4 years, once every 2 years, are brought into the civic discourse. That's how democratic politics works. Now, did they used to not hate each other? You know, I moved to the United States, and the first political officials I was introduced to were Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon. I don't think there was a lot of love lost between the three of them, as best I could tell. And that was good. What was different was that there were institutions that would channel their antagonisms and their disagreements into policy debates and into the need to govern. And so what has changed all over the democratic world is that those mediating and buffering institutions have failed. Primarily the political parties. When I was a kid, France was the Gaullists and the Socialists. Italy had a new government every 10 months, but it was always the same people. And it was always either made up with a majority of Socialist Party or Christian Democratic officials. These people were responsible for governing, and they took these very sometimes acute debates and ran them into programs of making things work. Imperfectly, but pretty well. And that was the period of democratic ascendancy. And these institutions, in turn, convened primarily through the parliament, through the Congress. There's not a single democratic country in the world today with a healthy parliament. And that's a tragedy that means we have big-time executive power and we have heightened court confrontations.
So I think that's just a really extraordinary sentence that you said. There is not a single democratic country today that has a healthy parliament.
Yeah.
Why?
So, you know, there's the old joke, it's turtles all the way down. But, you know, the parliament sits up here. What is the parliament? The parliament is various legislative factions. And first past the post, like the United States, it's 2. In proportional representation, it's multiple. But then they operate in there because they want to go back to their constituents and say, look what we did, or look what we were stopped from doing that we would do if we would do fully if we were in charge. How did they do that? Well, they represented in turn trade unions, churches, civic associations, small business associations, so they spoke for someone. We live in the Robert Putnam bowling alone world, and what that means is that these intermediary institutions have largely collapsed. The political parties don't represent anybody anymore, and that's why it's even more shocking in Europe than it is here. They've disappeared. The Gaullists and the Socialist Party, they don't exist anymore. Labor and Tories combined don't get more than 30%. So that's what's been driving the demise of democratic politics.
So I have a different view, because I don't think, or a partially different view, in the sense that I don't think politics in the 1960s or 1970s was anything like politics today in much of the West, including in the US, at least in the following several senses. First, many people on both sides believe elections have become existential. The normal workings of the democratic process are that sometimes my side wins, sometimes my side loses. If I lose in this election, it's okay. We live to fight another battle in the next election.
Kind of like the Donald Trump attitude towards the whole thing.
Well, Donald Trump is a reflection of, and partly, you know, a cause, at least in the United States, of the increasing sense that elections are existential, meaning if the other side wins, the country will never be the same in some irreversible way. We can't rely on the standard kind of democratic norm of rotation in office, the next election, you know, we can do better. When politics becomes existential for many people, it has huge ramifications of all sorts, including a belief that any means is justified to attain power and to retain power. So I think that's a fundamental difference from earlier decades. Secondly, politics has become much more totalizing in the sense that there used to be kind of a more bounded domain of the political. So there were areas, whether it was academia or the workplace or religious institutions that were kind of insulated from immediate engagement in the big political issues of the day. Now, because politics has become so totalizing, we fight in the workplace over the same issues. We fight within religious institutions, which are fragmented by these kind of political divides. Academia, of course, we know about all of the issues about the politicization of academia, and it's being drawn more directly into kind of day-to-day politics. So, with existential politics, with totalizing politics, and then connected, I think, to both of these is the rise of the cultural dimension in politics over the last 10 to 15 years, which plays a far more significant role than it did in the 1960s or 1970s or 1980s. We used to think it's the economy stupid. That's, the mantra of the Bill Clinton campaign that was successful in getting him elected. It's not the economy stupid anymore. It's the economy, it's immigration, it's various cultural issues. And another thing that's very different is we didn't hate each other in the same way in the 1960s and the 1970s. Because all of the data we have about the rise of what political scientists call affective polarization, which is like emotional polarization, is that individuals now hate people on the other side much more so than, at least according to the survey data in the past. If you look at these questions about would you be okay if your son or daughter married somebody of the other political party, that's far more divisive now than it was 20 years ago. So the toxic, tribalistic political culture that we experience day to day in this world of existential and totalizing politics, I think is really profoundly different from 30 or 40 years ago.
There's one more thing, and Bob, I don't know if you want to jump in on this or anybody else, and by the way, just feel free to interrupt each other and jump in. You won't be marked down. Which is across Western democracies, there has been not just all these developments that you so vividly described, but also a move to extremes at the same time. Why is that happening? And if you like, Rick, I don't know if you want to take this, or Bob, that may fold us into the next kind of big picture topic before we get down to the more granular US experience, which is the rise of the evolution of technology, the rise of social media, AI, et cetera.
Just one quick comment on the exchange before. I do agree that there's a difference in the quality of what has been referred to as hatred. I think once it acquires a certain dimension, then there's no rule for mediating institutions for a variety of reasons. One, nobody wants to mediate and nobody wants to compromise, because you can't compromise with people whose views you reject as sort of completely unacceptable and for which you hate them. So I think that it overwhelms the ability of institutions, either longstanding or modified in some sense, to play the mediating role that, in many respects, I think Sam rightly says. I mean, these institutions need to play in a democratic order. The second point about extremes, complicated topic. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I would start with this. The extremes feed off of extraordinary economic and social stresses. That's when you have the rise of extremism. When we were chatting beforehand, I think either Rick or Sam reminded those of us who were having this conversation that in the 1950s, the American Political Science Association did a famous study of political parties and concluded that the principal problem in American politics is that the parties were indistinguishable from each other. They just basically occupied the same ground. And in effect, politics was too peaceable. There wasn't enough ferment. There wasn't enough disagreement. Obviously, we're far from that now. And I think a lot of that has to do with just dramatic changes that are sweeping through the economy of this country, structurally speaking, demographically speaking, reflected in issues like immigration, and that is going to support a rise of extremism, both here and I think is also clearly visible abroad.
Can I build on that a little bit? So there is this pervasive dissatisfaction with democratic governments throughout the West over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think at some basic level, there's a pervasive sense that these governments, that these systems are not effectively addressing the major concerns of many, many of their citizens. It's kind of almost tautological, but I think that's a big part of what's going on. The concerns are partly in the economic realm, you know, starting with globalization, then the financial crisis, then COVID, and then in the cultural realm with the immigration issue, particularly in Europe. And what happened is the center-right and center-left parties here and overseas were just perceived as not effectively addressing these concerns. And so you see, you know, Sam was talking about the collapse of the traditional center-left and center-right parties. What's replaced them? It's parties that are more extreme, particularly on the right. But many of those parties began as anti-immigration parties when the major center-right and center-left parties weren't responding to large numbers of citizens who were having increasing concerns about that issue. Then I think these extreme parties become vehicles for more generalized disaffection or dissatisfaction with government. And one of the things that's really striking is if you look at young voters, both here and overseas, it's young voters who are particularly attracted to more extreme parties on the left and on the right. So to the extent you have the image of these new right parties in Europe in particular, you know, as supported by maybe reactionary older voters, that's not really true. And it's very, very concerning that young voters are so dissatisfied with what the systems have been delivering that they're willing to turn to more extreme alternatives on the left and the right. You can see that here in the United States in 2024. You know, Donald Trump got a much more significant share of young voters than Republican candidates traditionally did. Then you see on the Democratic side the rise of the socialist wing of the Democratic Party as a kind of expression of that dissatisfaction. And it's fundamentally that these governments just don't seem anymore to be able to deliver as they once did on commitments to increasing the material well-being of citizens, that people feel the next generation will do better than they're doing, and on the cultural issues that have become so prominent. Again, I think centered primarily on immigration, especially in Europe, though, you know, arguably Donald Trump got elected twice on that issue as well here.
And how, if it does technology bleed into that or affect that?
Let me add on that.
Please.
When we talk about the collapse of the center-left and center-right, it's a certain kind of politics where the parties were the gatekeepers to get into the political system. The parties were the only forces capable of propelling candidates forward, of nominating them, of bankrolling them, of engaging them in the governance process. And what we have now is the rise of free agency. You don't need, if you want to communicate to voters, the last thing in the world you want is to go meet with the chairs of the Democratic or Republican parties. Those are entirely useless individuals, as opposed to start a Twitter stream of some kind, especially if you have a provocative opening statement. And it's not just in the United States. I see my friend Dieter Grimm from Germany here. In Germany, the AfD is better at communicating. I'm sorry to say, it's better at communicating than the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats. And they constantly pull away the capacity of the institutionalized parties to organize discourse, debate, and governance. And so how does technology? It means I can raise money on my own. I don't want to raise money through an established party. Not even in Europe, where they get parliamentary subsidies. They're getting their money from individual big donors who bankroll the insurgent parties as they're coming up, just like we're seeing that process here. The nomination process is no longer internal to the parties. Here, we did it formally, beginning with the McGovern-Fraser amendments in the 1960s in the Democratic Party, but it's become institutionalized all over Europe that you have these insert. Look, Macron has been president of France for some time. He didn't even have a party. He went to a bunch of cafes and rounded up some friends to put up as an internet block. And that's why the technology has compounded this. It has fundamentally disrupted that gatekeeper monopoly that the parties used to have. And so my view is that we are in a moment of transition to a very different kind of politics. It may be plebiscitary. It may be that the legislative branch collapses over and over and that we see pure executive governance. But our politics is being reorganized, and the technology is a big part of it.
And Rick, did you have anything you wanted to add on that? Or should we just ask AI?
There are now people writing law review articles with AI, so not me yet. I'm going to hire a research assistant to do that. I agree with all of what Sam said about that. I also think the technology revolution makes it so much easier for people to participate in a variety of ways, but also so much easier to mobilize dissatisfaction and opposition and resistance. So everything government does is going to upset some set of interests, some set of actors, but it's so much easier now to quickly mobilize that opposition, to create unorganized actual demonstrations. The indignados in Spain is an example, the Yellow Vest in France, the truckers' opposition in Canada, and the like. These are not organized oppositions. There's no structure to them. There's no particular leadership to negotiate with for government. But it's much, much easier to mobilize opposition to anything government is considering doing, and to mobilize it quickly and effectively. This is part of the reason, by the way,
we used to understand that could be a good thing.
It's a mixed thing, right? So, of course, opposition is good or healthy or appropriate in democracy, but when it gets to a level at which authority is kind of constantly delegitimated, constantly resisted in these ways, you get this incredibly turbulent kind of politics in which lots of additional participation and constant dissatisfaction, which is kind of a characteristic of our era. So one statistic on this that stays in my head in the US that I find so fascinating is since 2000, in every 2-year election but two, either the House, the Senate, or the White House has changed partisan hands. That's never happened before in American history. And arguably, the technology also enables candidates and parties to target voters in a much more effective way. So maybe one reason we're constantly in this 50-50 balance is related also to the incredible micro-targeting of voters and messages and the like that's
the
possible.
micro-drawing of districts.
And the micro-drawing of districts.
But it happens
But my
in
favorite, my favorite example of, this is a German example, of how technology has changed things. There's a story about an anonymous guy who was a YouTube rock star, not rock star, but a rock musician named Reza in Germany. And about a week before the European parliamentary elections a few years back, he had never been involved in political activism. He decided to make a YouTube video. It was like a 55 minute mashup video, very quick cuts, very clever, very creative, making fun of most of the political parties, especially the party in power. There's a single guy sitting in his parents' basement. This video was viewed 9 million times in the week in the run-up to the European election. Candidates started being asked about it. They didn't know how to respond. One of the parties thought, well, let's put out a PDF explaining all the false information and the like, And the vote share for it was the Christian Democrats that he mainly attacked. Their vote share went down significantly in that week. We don't know for sure if that's why, but that's an extraordinary thing, right? Now, is that a good thing? There are positive features to it, but it's also an example of how the technology empowers not necessarily representative individuals or organizations to, kind of mobilize opposition to the government that happens to be in power at any particular moment.
Let me add one thing. Rick and I wrote a piece not too long ago about the hidden costs of government ineffectiveness in democratic stabilization and democratic success. And one of the features of the environment we live in is that governments have a very short lifespan in which they can do anything. I believe at present, and my numbers may be off, but I think there's only 3 democratically elected heads of state who poll in the surveys at above 50% approval. I think it's Sheinbaum, Maloney, and Modi. I can't think of any others who come in over 50%. Most are at the levels 20%, 25% and lower, and they get elected with that level of popularity because they're being attacked all the time in ways that are outside conventional politics, and then it decreases from that. We see elected heads of state today with public support ratings 10, 12, 15%, in some countries in single digits. You can't govern on that basis, which means you can't deliver, which means we're into this cycle of institutional failure at the most fundamental level, because people want to get up in the morning, they want the water to be running. They want there not to have been fires or thefts in their neighborhood. Those kinds of basic understandings of governmental services is where we're failing.
Well, now that we've all been cheered up,
Yeah.
you can keep cheering us up.
Well,
And
no,
this is all Bob's fault,
Yeah.
but so you.
And we're going to get to that.
So this just reminded me of something. I'll try to be brief about this. This just reminded me something about the failure of parliaments. So with the disaffection and the search for alternatives and the rise of insurgent parties, particularly in the PR systems, proportional representation systems of Europe, what you get is parliaments that are much more fragmented across many more political parties. And so you get this perverse dynamic. People are dissatisfied. They are fleeing the traditional center-right and center-left parties that governed since World War II until this last 10 to 15-year period. They support these insurgent parties, and yet they create these parliaments that are then so fragmented that, as I say, perversely, they're even less able to deliver on the issues that so many of the citizens are dissatisfied about. We see that less here because we have the two-party system, but you still see it here some because our two parties get fragmented internally by a lot of these same forces.
Some more than others.
Well, the Republican Party in the first Trump administration couldn't really enact anything significant except tax reform because of internal divisions in the Republican Party. And that's an issue that's he's kind of currently confronting.
So I want to get us to, now that we've been at 30,000 feet, to lower a little bit and to talk about the situation in the United States. So as I was saying, now that we've all been cheered up, I'm going to ask a really cheery question, starting with you, Bob. Looking at the health of our U.S. democracy today, what worries you the most?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way I've set this question up, once that is claimed, you have to come up with a different thing that worries you.
There's a good bit to choose from, and I guess I'm going to go by category and just pick from this particular category, which is an institutional governing category, and it's an obvious one, which is we are paying the price in the current government, and I mean this in nonpartisan terms, and I know there are a good number of Republicans who agree with me, whether they speak out loud or not. We're paying the price of the impossible metastasis in the metastasizing of the role and power of the executive in the United States. We could talk about the weakness of the legislative branch. That is certainly part of the story. But there is a huge problem that has developed over an extended period of time, and both parties are complicit. They have wanted, and in many respects the democratic system favors, the current democratic selection system favors, a focus on the executive as the answer to the nation's problems, with a set of expectations that executives claim they can meet, executive candidates for executive office claim they can meet, and then when elected, they set out under tremendous pressure to meet. And the result of this is the rise of, for want of a better term, I'll say presidential Caesarism. Now, Republicans like, for example, on war powers issues and other issues, to point in the direction of Democrats and say, this is not a story just on one side of the aisle. And I think that's true. However, differences of degree can become differences of kind. And we now have a significant difference in kind. I think the current war in Iran is an example. We can argue about war powers. All administrations have to answer for presidential deployments of force without congressional authorization. But I think this is in many respects a case apart. There are other examples of that. Government by executive order. Yes, they've been challenged. The courts have been put in the position of resisting, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. Executive orders have been used not merely, by the way, to achieve policy objectives that presidents cannot accomplish in the legislative process, but also to permit presidents to single out adversaries and to settle scores. Norms that used to separate law enforcement from politics, because presidents have always had the option, and some presidents have exercised it to some degree, to control the Department of Justice for improper ends, for politicized ends. That has now been developed into an article of constitutional faith, if you will, under the current administration, that the president not only can, but the president should. And so the senior ranks of the Department of Justice are now filled with personal lawyers, people who served him in a personal legal representational capacity. And it is his expectation, and in fact his direction, that they do what it is that he wants them to do or refrain from doing what he doesn't want them to do. We're really in an extremely dangerous zone. As I said, there's a lot of blame to be shared. On a political cultural level, and I'll just stop with this, because I think there are reforms that we could implement.
We're going to get to the
I'm
improvement part.
I'm trying to, I said that only to introduce a mild note of optimism into a
We'll get there.
But we'll get there. But I just want to stress there's a public cultural problem that we have, which is, and we'll see it again in 4 years, the American public elects the president on outlandish expectations in response to outlandish promises of what one person can accomplish, exercising the authority of that office, which necessarily therefore expands in accordance with that promise-making spree.
But I'm smiling here because I'm thinking about outlandish expectations and outlandish promises made by certain candidates you worked very hard to elect, and I'm just going to finish up, and then you can. I got the floor right now. It's my microphone.
Can I just note in response? Can I just note in response to that the difference was the outlandish promises they made were the ones that I wanted them to make.
Well, yes, but you talked about presidential Caesarism, and I remember a certain guy who announced that he had a pen and a phone.
Yes, I absolutely think. And I wrote with Jack Goldsmith a book about presidential institutional reform. Every single chapter opens across the broad range of presidential authorities with the story leading up to Trump, and then the reform case. But there is often a very damning story that leads up to Trump.
That was all. So if I'm understanding you right, and I'm not actually disagreeing with you about this part, there's always a precursor, there's always a tweet, there's always a presidential action, but this is different.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Rick, your worries?
Well, since Bob claimed the executive branch is his worry, I think I'll focus
It's unitary, so he just gets the whole thing.
I think I'll focus on Congress. So I think what we've been seeing over this last 10 or 15 years is that when government, and I think the legislature primarily, seems incapable of delivering on the major issues of the day, it inevitably leads people to turn to, they may withdraw, they may be angry, even worse, it can lead them to yearn for kind of strongman figures who will cut through all this dysfunction and actually take on these issues. So it's not just that presidents are, the expectations are so high, it's that when the political process is paralyzed, as it has been largely in the United States now, it's inevitable that you're going to see more power going to the executive, more power going to the courts. And so I think the fact that we have these hyper-polarized political parties in a system with bicameralism and separation of powers, which requires a fair degree of cooperation to actually make that process work. I mean, there are things that get done during periods of unified government, but even during unified government, the legislature, for example, the last congressional session enacted fewer laws than in any time in 30 or 40 years, maybe longer. So I think the dysfunction of Congress, the inability of Congress to address issues that everyone understands they need to address, whether it's immigration policy or environmental policy or labor policy, all these areas that Congress hasn't spoken about in any major way in many of these contexts 30, 40 years, I think is the deep root of the dysfunction. And it worries me enormously about whether we can actually make Congress a more functional institution, a more central institution. I do have, I'll hold off for now, institutional reform ideas, because I think a lot of the dysfunction and the polarization comes from the institutional structures in which we conduct elections and the kind of people who are then encouraged or incentivized to run, what their incentives are when they're in office. But I think the dysfunction and paralysis of the legislative branch is a huge underlying source of the dissatisfaction and the increasing turn to executive orders, whether it's under President Obama, President Biden, President Trump. We've seen this explosion in the use of executive orders because people focus on the presidency if nothing else is happening. And so I guess I would focus on Congress as my biggest concern.
And just one small question on that, and we'll get back to, I promise, the larger reforms. But would doing away with the filibuster improve the situation or worsen the situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because I'm of mixed views about that, right? So if you think checks and balances are or ought to be an important feature of the system, it's no longer the case in the way Madison envisioned that, ambition would counteract ambition, as he put it, right? That each institution would have an ambition of its own to resist the presidency, or the House would resist the Senate. Once we have the kind of party politics we have, the partisans have shared fates with other partisans, whether they're in the White House, the House, or the Senate. And so the system just doesn't work in the way it was designed because of the rise of parties and the nature of our hyper-polarized parties. So when you have unified government, as we currently do, you get almost no effective check on a president. When you have divided government, the system doesn't function. So getting rid of the filibuster would enable the legislative process to function more when you had unified government, but you would eliminate one of the only kind of checks that currently exist by requiring a certain amount of bipartisan support to legislate. Now, I'm a big believer in other systems that create oppositional party rights as a way of checking the executive when the party in power controls both the legislature and the executive. So a lot of post-World War II systems, again, the German system is an example, which were much more self-consciously designed to think about party politics, created various powers that the opposition party or parties have in the legislature, not to control legislation, because the majority should rule, but to have committees they chair that audit the government, or to be able to call certain kinds of hearings, to engage in certain oversight. We don't really have effective oversight during unified government, and I think that's true under Democrats as well as Republicans. And so that's why I have mixed views about the filibuster, because it is one of the few institutionalized kind of check and balance we still have, but it also does make it harder, even during unified government, for Congress to legislate. So maybe that's copping out, but that's my ambivalence.
Ambivalence is probably often the right answer to hard questions. Sam, I do not want to leave you with the worrying about the third branch of government
Well-
as your worry. So you can
No, they
pick
did-
anything.
They took the executive, they got to pick first, so they took
But
the
no, you can-
executive
you
and
can-
the
you can-
Congress.
you can
No,
pick
that's
a
okay.
subset.
I'll go to our third,
Okay.
I'll go to our third branch, professional sports. Oh, no. No, let me talk about the judiciary, because this is an increasingly difficult question in the democratic world. The range of cases that in the United States we would once call political questions has correlates in virtually every legal system. There are certain things which were thought to be outside the bounds of what the courts could do in those countries, including the apex courts. That has largely broken down, and we see political matters, matters of first instance governing, coming before judicial bodies all over the world in ways that were unimaginable when I was a law student 40 years ago. It just could not. There's nothing that prepared me in my legal education for the role that courts routinely have now. And the problem is a reflection of what Rick and Bob were talking about. You have these hyperactive executives now that have taken over, and you know one of the great set of decisions in recent times came from the UK Supreme Court in what I think is, as the Supreme Court, the most important decisions they rendered were called Miller 1 and Miller 2, and it was about the fundamentals of what a parliamentary system must look like, including when it breaks down and can't address the central issue of the day, which was Brexit, and how the prime minister and the ministers could not simply substitute themselves for the parliamentary authority. That was hugely important as a matter of jurisprudence and also as a matter of recentering British politics. But so you have this super strong executive, you have a weak parliament, and so you have things that are not responsive to the moment. So we are debating in the United States in the current, with refugees, with asylum claims, with illegal immigration and all that, we're debating what does the terminology of the Alien Enemies Act mean in this context. Alien Enemies Act is from almost 250 years ago to deal with France illegally seizing our merchant marine during the Napoleonic Wars. Lunacy that's how we are debating what to do with Venezuela at present. Why is that debate taking place? Because Congress hasn't touched it. We're asking in the tariff cases, what does it mean the way we crafted emergency legislation in response to the Arab oil embargo? How does that apply to governing entirely through the tariff system? It's the wrong question.
Isn't that the normal role of courts?
It's the normal role of courts as an interactive body. Rick and I, again, a paper we go back a long way, but a paper we wrote together once where we were curious. Yeah, I go back further.
We all
right?
go back a long way.
So 20 years ago, we were wondering about the war on terror. And we were trying to figure out how do courts respond to the claims of terror. And what we discovered was that the American jurisprudence was really, has Congress authorized the executive to do this? So there was a way that courts looked at these questions, but they looked at them through the prism of, is the system working properly? And today, when you read the court's opinion in the tariff cases or first order cases like that, they're no longer asking whether the system is working properly. They're trying to find their way through where the executive claims unbridled power on the one hand, which the court historically has rejected, but where Congress commands no corresponding authority on its part, so that the pressure on the courts is to fill in for this instability, fundamental instability in our political system. And I don't think courts are good at that. I don't think they're the proper branch. They can just temporize, but they can't be an instrument of governance for any long period of time.
I think that we should keep on. There's a bunch of law students here, so you read a lot of court opinions. You think a lot about the role of courts. Because I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, or at least prod you a little bit. and let the others then make the case for me better than I could make it myself, which is there's a lot of things that the courts, the apex court and courts have done during the Trump administration that I disagree with, but I also think that in many situations, the court and the courts have risen to the challenge time after time. So and I know you got stuck going third here, and we're going to reverse the order when we fix things, but
it
I would
didn't work
say
out this way.
as we look at the branches and what we're worrying about, it's kind of my job to worry about the courts, but it's the branch I guess I worry about least these days, or that seems least dysfunctional to me and least going outside what its realm should be, as much as I disagree with many, many, many decisions that it has reached.
I don't disagree with that.
Please explain why I'm right.
Just a very quick
Or-
comment,
yeah.
I guess, that, because this is complicated to sort through all the different things the courts have been doing, have been asked to do. But the tariff decision, in my view, is the biggest loss a president has had in American history. And I say that because,
And you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
well, I think it shows the courts, whatever else you think about the Supreme Court's decisions on different issues, I think we shouldn't ignore how consequential that decision was. You can compare it to, let's say, the steel seizure case, but that was a one-off action by President Truman. You can compare it to the Nixon tapes case, which was very significant because it was intimately involved in Nixon being forced to resign from the presidency. But again, that's kind of a one-off thing. I think you have to go back to the New Deal when the Supreme Court struck down parts of the National Industrial Recovery Act during FDR to find anything of comparable significance. Tariff policy was the centerpiece of what Donald Trump ran on and his tool of governance. Now, he still has other, tariff statutes he can try
Bigger
to
and better
use.
than ever.
What's that?
Bigger and better than ever.
Well, and there's going to be, there are legal disputes about whether he can exercise power under this statute or the other. But those other statutes are much more confining. They have much more process involved. They're much more limited in what he can do. He can't use those in the way he had been using the tariffs up till now. So if you're asking about a comparable thing, it would be the Supreme Court striking down Obamacare. I think that would be the closest analog to what the court did in the tariffs case. Now, the court didn't do that.
Didn't, okay.
Didn't do that. So, but it was a fi- it was a
You
fi- it
would
was a-
remember. Oh, my God. I had no idea.
For about 20 seconds, it was thought.
So, and the court is just now getting to the merits of a lot of the Trump administration action. So in the first year, a lot of what the court was dealing with was on the emergency docket or the shadow docket. And these were largely procedural issues, jurisdictional issues. They were not reaching the merits of policies. Now we're moving into the phase where the court is actually confronting the merits of a number of significant Trump administration policies. So obviously, in addition to the tariff ruling this term, they're going to decide the birthright citizenship executive order. They're going to reach the merits of that. They're going to decide on whether his attempt to fire one of the governors of the Federal Reserve System was lawful, which is a decision of huge significance. So we're now moving into the phase where we're seeing the court confronting the administration on the merits of these issues. And frankly, I think the court is in a much stronger position now than it was in the first year of the Trump administration because politically he's much less powerful, much less popular than he was, as most presidents are in the sort of honeymoon period after they're first elected. So we'll see. It's certainly too early to come to any general judgment about how the judicial system or the Supreme Court in particular is responding to this moment. But I would not underestimate the significance of that tariff decision.
But, Baba, how do I put together that tariff decision with the same court who, yes, Lisa Cook, but also poised to overrule Humphrey's executor? But more important, how do I put together that tariff decision with the court that decided Trump versus United States, the immunity case?
That is a huge question. And I want to be,
And that will be our next lunch.
I want to be very brief about it. First of all, I will say, I think that while the craftsmanship of the immunity decision was, from my point of view, deeply problematic, and there are aspects of that decision that I don't agree with, I also do not think that it was as accurately portrayed in the aftermath. There were reasons why I was not at all surprised, and if you listen to the oral argument on the government's part in the Biden administration, you would not be surprised that the court wound up somewhere in the vicinity of where it did. So I just want to start by saying, it's often said that immunity decision was this breakthrough attempt to give the president an absolute ticket out of any legal difficulty whatsoever, and I do not think that's an accurate statement. I do think that the craftsmanship of the opinion presented problems that have compounded the public misunderstanding of the case. And I put that on the court, of course. So I want to say that I think that is, if you view the immunity case as an example of the Supreme Court simply looking to do whatever Donald Trump wants it to do, which, by the way, in some quarters has been the characterization, not at all, it's not a measured characterization, but you hear it lying down for Trump, right? Well, if you see it that way, then it's hard to understand the tariff case, but I don't think it's the right way to look at the immunity decision. And we can talk about the immunity decision more if you want. I won't get off on that. I do think also, I just want to mention this, and I say this trying very hard, yes, I'm a Democrat, but it's useless to try to discuss and think about these issues in partisan terms, because then you don't get anywhere. It's not terribly illuminating to get trapped by your own, partisan talking points. So I try to think beyond them, as I think most of us do. I do think that Trump has presented a particular challenge in the way that he has proceeded. You can characterize it any way you want. You can say it's very Trumpy and that's worked for him. You can say it's chaotic. You can say it's incompetent. You can say there's no messaging discipline. You can say all of those things. But he created a situation, a record, if you will, outside the courtroom, but some of it seeped into the record, that I think made it extraordinarily difficult for the court to take the legal arguments that he had as an executive seriously. I'm going to use the tariff to punish a country for failing to pardon or protect from prosecution a head of state who's been persecuted the way I was, okay? Which was, despite if I'm not missing the country here, directed at Brazil, okay? I'm going to raise it up this way because you annoyed me, and I'm going to take it back down this way because the markets aren't responding well to it. That backdrop of completely chaotic, undisciplined, personalist, in some cases vindictive, vengeful behavior provoked the court, I think, significantly, setting aside the merits, as you might see them one way or the other, of whether he could act the way he purported to do under IEPA.
I want to make sure we have some time for questions, so I am going to award a magic wand, but starting with you, Sam, of what, and you can change, you can use this wand a couple different times. That's what makes it magic. To institute whatever your top 1, 2, 3 reforms are in the system, in our system, the U.S. system, that would not transform and bring back a completely healthy democracy, but that would significantly improve it.
I would get rid of the other two people who took up all that time.
He never thinks he gets enough time.
If it were up to me, the magic wand, it would be directed at what are the institutions that we might still be able to salvage today. And I would take a run at what we can do to shore up the political parties, which are so weak. So I would free up money to the political parties. So here's a scandalous proposal: unlimited contributions to political parties. I've been pushing that for a while. The money now goes to shadow institutions. It's the worst system we could possibly have. Unlimited money to political parties, give Rick mentioned this, the equivalent of the shadow government in Britain or the way that the Germans do it. The minority party, even in unified government, gets 4 hearings a year per committee, something like that, accountability. There has to be a way of fueling things back institutionally so we have partisan politics that is driven toward delivering something. Right now, it's just partisan politics for the purpose of raising money and hopefully prevailing in an election in order to prevail in the next election and raise more money again. So that's where I would start.
So I think from what we know from data, voters are not nearly as polarized as members of Congress are. I think there are a variety of features in the institutional structure of politics that have accentuated the extremism or polarization. So number one, I would move to the Alaska model for primary elections. I think primary elections have become an incredible driver of extremism. The Alaska model is every candidate runs in a single primary, the top 4 go to the general election, so you don't have party primaries that filter out candidates who would have the support of a majority of the electorate if they could get through to the general election. I would use ranked choice voting in elections so that candidates who get 35% support, which is about a third of the primary winners in the country, get 35% support, can't get elected. They're too factional. If you have ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, you need a majority support to get elected. I think our campaign finance system, we don't talk about it this way. We talk about it in terms of equality or corruption, but the campaign finance system is an incredible driver of extremism because individual donors come from the ideological poles of the spectrum. Small donors, even more so. So I would go to public financing where the money comes from general treasury funds. I would emphasize creating competitive election districts. We spend so much time worrying about partisanly fair outcomes from districting that we've neglected the importance of creating competitive districts. You can have a very fair system. Democrats get a proportionate share of seats, Republicans do as well, but everybody's in a safe seat. When you're in a safe seat, you have no incentives to respond to the center of the electorate. Now, those are all, I think, in the realm of reasonably practical reforms. I'm not talking about things that I think are just unrealistic. But I will offer one that's unrealistic because it's one of my...
I thought the public financing was pretty unrealistic. But
Well, at the state level.
Okay.
So we do have like 10 states or so that have public financing. The most radical change we made to the American political system in the last 50 years was when we got rid of the convention system for nominating candidates for the presidency and shifted to the primary-based election system. At the time that system was created, there were political scientists arguing against it who said this is going to lead to the election of more demagogic figures who would get elected, not because they had strong ties to party structures and party commitments, but by stirring up hatred and mass alienation and the like. We're not going to get back there, but I think at least starting a discussion about whether a system of nomination, which many other democratic countries use, in which elected party figures from throughout the country actually have some meaningful say in who their party nominee is, as opposed to the system, this purely sort of populist, plebiscitary system of primary elections. Now that one I realize is the most far-fetched, but those are all designed to try to combat the extremism and polarization through institutional design.
all right, Bob, finish up.
Very briefly, I, by the way, agree but largely disagree with a good bit of what Rick said, but that's for another day. 2 things real quickly in the executive category, which I picked up, and so I'll just stick with it. One, we need regulation to impose conflict of interest standards on the executive branch. The profiteering in this current administration is unlike any in American history. It is not a good example to set for other presidents to follow. It has wide-ranging ramifications. Number 2, war powers is a huge problem, but Congress needs to legislate to put controls on how the president can use nuclear weaponry.
All right. If there are questions, please come up to the microphone to ask the question, and please make sure it's brief and in question form.
I guess I'll move this over here.
Good idea.
Thank you all for your time. There's been a lot of characterization as some of the discontent with modern parties as coming from the bottom up and with kind of modern issues, but there's also a lot of top-down creation of new issues. I'm thinking the media narratives surrounding Somali fraud in Minnesota, elected officials pushing narratives surrounding voter fraud that then lead to serious changes. And I'm curious, within the modern political environment, if you have thoughts on, number one, is that distinctive compared to past eras? And number two, what safeguards might be put against the creation of false narratives from the top down that foment kind of the unrest that we've seen?
You know, 130 years ago, if we'd been sitting here, we would talk about the horrors of the yellow press, which was the broadsheets that did nothing but carry scandal and which were thought to be the fuel for populist politics in the late 19th, early 20th century. I think this is an ever-present feature. I think that, you know, there's, I like to use the line that I used to play a lot of basketball, and in basketball, among old basketball players, it's the older I get, the better I was. You know, your mind is now liberated from reality. I think that we should not hearken back to a past that was so rosy. You know, these political parties were venal, they were corrupt, they were a scourge on many parts of domestic life in the United States, but they also built this system. And so I think we should not, you know, say it's so terrible now because people have strongly held views. People had strongly held views over slavery. People had strongly held views over whether we should go into World War II, and that's the appropriate subject of politics, in my view.
Other comments or another question? Did you have a question? Please.
Hi, thank you so much. You've spoken a lot about the high level federal government, like from the executive to members of Congress. I'm more curious about election officials, for example, some of the people who are at the base level of democracy. What do you have to say, or any suggestions about how to ensure that it remains nonpartisan, that it remains fair, and that there's information sharing, that kind of stuff?
I'm sorry, I lost the question there at the end. Apologies. Could you say
It's
it?
whether the people who are making the system run are still doing a
Election
good job, are
administrators.
still fair.
Election
And so-
administration.
Yeah, election administrators in the United States receive very little money relative to the tasks they have to perform, and work with outmoded equipment and sometimes extremely poor support, which is reflected in their budgets, by the elected officialdom. They do an extraordinary job across the board, an extraordinary job. And it's a disgrace that we don't support election administration in the United States better than we do. I have no concerns about the vast majority of election administrators in the United States on either side of the aisle. In other work that I do, I talk to them frequently, go to panels with them and the like. We just need to let them do their job. And in 2014, just last sentence, 2014, the Presidential Commission on Election Administration reported to President Obama. It was bipartisan, truly bipartisan, and it made the fundamental point that election administration is an aspect of public administration that requires professionalism and technical prowess. For the most part, we have it, although we're asking them to operate under very difficult conditions. So I have total confidence if they're permitted to do their jobs.
Time for
Dieter.
one more question?
Let's hear from Dieter.
Well, we'll have time for two. Okay, we'll have time for one. Okay.
Only if a comment is allowed. I have no question.
Go ahead,
Yes.
please.
For me, as a foreign observer, this was an extremely rich and interesting debate. But I think two factors that explain the current situations were missing from the debate. The first one is that I think that in most of our democracies, the ability to agree on what the facts are, the ability to agree that there is a reality independent of one's beliefs and interests exist, does no longer exist. So truth is itself now a matter of belief. And how will you produce a democratic discourse if you cannot reach this agreement? The second point, probably less so noticed in the United States as a superpower, but in many other countries, ever more political substance goes from the states to the international level, where they are handled in a non-democratic way, but the democratic governments of the states are nevertheless made responsible for that. Point three that was treated here, fragmentation of parliaments and in decreasing ability of political parties. Why are parliaments fragmented? In the first place, because the electorate is fragmented. And why are political parties no longer to deliver what they are expected to do and address the wishes of the people? Because the people, in a long process, has become so individualized that it has become extremely difficult for political parties to fulfill the role that they originally had. And this is not easily to redress. And point number 4, I think when it comes to courts, the most important, or one of the most important shortcomings of the American Constitution is that amendments are almost impossible. That's to say, adaptation of the Constitution to current challenges comes to the courts and at the same time politicizes the courts more than before.
Let me just, for our students, this is Professor Dieter Grimm from Berlin, who for many years was a member of the German Constitutional Court and is here visiting with us this semester.
And a great set of points to end on. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope you enjoy future iterations of the NYU Law
And if you
Forum.
want to work for the Democracy Project, there's going to be summer positions. We're going to be posting for students. So keep an eye out for that.